Hello and welcome to NPTEL MOOC's course on development research methods. In this lesson, we will study about interviews and focus group discussions. Now, interviews and focus group discussions are generally categorized under the methods that qualify as qualitative research methods. However, when we move across boundaries and go towards interdisciplinary research, we have seen that interviews and focus group discussions can actually go on to strengthen the quantitative data that we have gathered through questionnaires or various other kinds of methods that qualify as quantitative research methods. So, in that sense, interviews and focus group discussions have become integral to various studies in which the focus is on collecting the in-depth information about the sample that we are studying. Now, generally when we think about interviews, it strikes to us as something which is very formal. However, if you look at the number of the kinds of interviews and focus group discussions that are carried out for better analyzing the research results that we have, you would see that there is a wide diversity in terms of the interviews that are carried out. Now, they range from being completely unstructured interviews to very structured interviews. So, keeping these things in mind, let us streamline our discussion with regard to some of the very important things that needs to be kept in mind when we are carrying out interviews and focus group discussions. So, what we will cover in today's lecture are as follows. Why should we do interviews? What are the different types of interviews? Interview strategies and processes, what are focus groups, and then finally we will focus on incorporating focus groups into a development project. What are the things that we should keep in mind when we are incorporating FGDs into a development project, and finally I will end with some of the key steps that needs to be kept in mind when we are undertaking a focus group discussion. So, now why we do interviews? Interviews are some of the main channels of information gathering, but they are also used as a starting point or background to support other forms of data collection. Now, bear in mind that when we are talking about interviews, we are mostly talking about personal interviews, one-on-one interviews that are carried out with sample that are carefully chosen based upon certain criteria, and those criteria that are to be kept in mind for collecting our sample depends upon the research problem that we are investigating. Whereas focus group discussions are usually carried out in a group, and that is one of the major difference between personal interviews and focus group discussions. Group interviews vis-a-vis one-on-one interviews with key informants or any other stakeholder that are integral to the research problem that we have undertaken. Now, valuable method of gaining insight into people's perceptions, understanding and experiences of a given phenomenon, that is something which is one of the main objectives of why we should carry out interviews, and also they can contribute to in-depth data collection. Often when we are carrying out questionnaire surveys, questionnaire based surveys that qualify as quantitative research, you would see that there is and often when they are structured questionnaires, there is not much scope to take into account the sample, the respondents comments and the respondents interpretation regarding a certain question that we are investigating. And however, to get a big picture or the overall picture of the problem that we are studying, often we depend upon personal interviews after the sample surveys are concluded. A quantitative research interview seeks to cover both factual and a meaning level, though it is usually more difficult to interview on a meaning level. Meaning level here basically means the respondent's own interpretation about a certain question that we are asking. So, for example, if we have a question on the food security status of the respondent, of a woman respondent or a male head or a female head who is a respondent of our study, often when we have questions regarding the frequency of meals taken by the households and it is being responded with a male or the female head, the structured questionnaires will have space with regard to capturing only the amount of meals taken and the frequency with which it is taken. However, the respondents' own interpretation regarding their food security status does not get captured in these kinds of surveys. And if the survey results moves towards informing policy in that area, often it is useful to go back to the informants or to the respondents and make them a key informant and collect further information regarding their own perceptions about their food security status that can go a very long way in informing public policy. So, therefore, these are some of the reasons why interviews need to be carried out. Now, interviews are an excellent way of gaining factual information such as details of NGO policies and government initiatives, or for generating information such as the ways in which particular policies were devised. It is also an opportunity to examine processes, motivations and reasons for success or failures, and it also provides qualitative dimensions such as providing explanations for patterns or considering attitudes and opinions. Often in the previous classes, I have taken examples from NREGS programs, from complementary feeding practices or other kinds of nutrition policies that are integral to a development project that we are studying. And these are also the areas where personal interviews go a long way in helping us come up with proper conclusions regarding what are the people's perceptions regarding government interventions that have been carried out, and how it can be further improved upon, and what are the successes and failures of interventions carried out by various agencies. Now, as I said, the types of interviews are diverse and they range from being unstructured interviews to structured interviews, and one of the most dominant forms of interviews, personal interviews that are carried out as part of research processes in social sciences, are semi-structured interviews. This is so because often the respondent's answer or the key informant's answer informs the interviewer regarding the questions that should follow, and therefore it works in the best interest of the interviewer and the research that we are undertaking to have to conduct semi-structured interviews. So, what are these different interviews and what are the basic characteristics of these different kinds of interviews? Structured interview basically looks like a preset list of questions which are often standardized across interviewees. So, depending upon the respondents that we have identified, or the key informants that we have identified for our study, the set of questions does not change across the interviewees that we are interviewing. However, semi-structured interview does not take place in such a manner. Therefore, in structured interviews there is not much room for veering off the topic in question. If a certain question number 1 is being asked to a certain interviewee 1, then the same question gets repeated across all the interviewees, and there is no scope for the interviewer to go around to veer off the topic that is being asked. In structured interviews, questions are set in a clear and unambiguous manner that is clearly understandable, and this is primarily because it is a standardized set of questions and it should not change across interviewees. Semi-structured interviews, on the other hand, are interview schedules with suggested themes. There is scope for the interviewees to develop their processes. Therefore, the semi-structured interview schedules are usually not presented in the form of questions, but as different kinds of themes. We will take one of the examples of semi-structured interview in this lecture also. So, semi-structured interviews have a more flexible approach, and the issues are explored from an individualistic perspective, keeping room to understand that the responses of the interviewees might enable the interviewer to understand what are the different kinds of questions that may be asked to the other interviewees, and of course, these are not standardized. These questions come up based upon the responses that the interviewer is getting. Unstructured interviews are non-directive. They usually comprise themes rather than specific questions, and there is an opportunity to take the discussion in whichever direction the interviewees choose. And unstructured interviews are often more conversational in that they are not directed by the interviewer. And unstructured interviews are therefore best recorded because of the conversational style of the interview, and there is no specified duration or time limit within which unstructured interviews can get over. However, unstructured interviews in certain cases can also provide a great variety of information and in-depth information, and it can also give us cues with regard to the social networks of the individual that is being interviewed, and therefore unstructured interviews often gives us the scope to go into a snowballing technique of finding a sample, wherein the interviewee informs the interviewer who all should be interviewed because of the conversations continuing regarding the question that we are investigating. This is an example of a semi-structured interview. This example comes from a part of a study of women's paid and unpaid work in Oaxaca city in Mexico. where the objective was to look at the similarities and differences between socio-economic groups and the importance of social networks within women's working lives. So, the interviewer structured the interview schedule in such a manner, deciding on the themes that should be taken up as part of the later research process. So, first it begins with an introduction to the research. The interviewer informs the interviewee regarding the research that she is carrying out, the issues regarding confidentiality, whether confidentiality relates to the interviewee or the confidentiality with regard to the reporting of the research is discussed with the interviewee, and also permissions regarding taping of the or recording of the interviews is also taken from the interviewee. Then there is a general conversation about household, house and neighborhood. Now, one point that needs to be kept in mind here is that often personal interviews are either done at the beginning of a study or at the end of a study. At the beginning of the study, personal interviews are undertaken to break the ice between the interviewer and the interviewee, and also it helps us to lay down the basic foundation of the work that we are pursuing. And when personal interviews are carried out at the end of the study, it often follows the elaborate surveys or case studies that we have carried out, and therefore personal interviews go on to provide us in-depth information about the key informants that can give us the big picture of what the study is all about. So, the second theme was on general conversation about households, house and the neighborhood. The third theme was on paid work, so choice of employment, how job was secured, opinion of work, future plans, difficulties, if not in paid work at moment, discuss paid work in the past, reasons for not being in paid work, future plans. So, in this theme you would see that since the objective is to look at the similarities and differences between socio-economic groups with regard to women's paid and unpaid work in a certain city in Mexico. So, one of the first themes that the interviewer has highlighted on is paid work, and what are the possible set of questions that can be asked with regard to paid work as are put together under a certain theme. Fourth, because again the focus is on paid and unpaid work, and mostly unpaid work emerges out of domestic tasks. So, the fourth theme that has been highlighted is domestic tasks, the types of activities, time taken, help provided, opinions in domestic work and so on. Fifth is community activities, community organizations, church, work-based groups, reasons for involvement in these community organizations and nature of involvement. Now, why the focus is on community activities? Because the objective highlights that the researcher is looking also at the importance of social networks within women's work, so women's lives. So, they are not just looking at paid and unpaid works that women are taking up. The researcher is also trying to look into the social networks that might go on to inform their income outcomes or their well-being outcomes in totality. Finally, on socializing, meeting with friends, family, their kin, neighbors, feelings of belonging, isolation and so on. So, these are and this also, so the information provided by the interviewee on socializing also goes on to inform the social networks of the women that are being studied here. Finally, the question, there are other questions. So, these questions come up as a part of the interview. Sometimes the and oftentimes actually the interviewer can also ask the interviewee regarding questions that may be asked to the interviewer about the research that is being undertaken, as some important interpretations and comments can come up from the interviewee also with regard to the research question that we are investigating. So, this is a plain simple format of how a semi-structured interview it's not exactly a questionnaire, but a semi-structured interview schedule looks like, and various more themes can be added on depending upon the research question that we have taken up for our purpose. Now, let us come to interview strategies. One is, of course, we have seen what are interviews, what are the different kinds of interviews, and what can different interview schedules look like. And the focus here was I focused mostly on semi-structured interview schedules, because that is one of the most dominant forms of carrying out interviews in development research. However, there are also interview strategies that needs to be kept in mind when following this method. One is, of course, with regard to recruiting of interviewees. Who should we interview and how should we identify who should be interviewed? Oftentimes I have used the term called key informant, and this key informant is very central to development research, because identifying key informant is one of the primary tasks of carrying out research, particularly qualitative research in this field. And recruiting of key informants for interviews, for personal interviews as a research method is of utmost importance, because most of the conclusions that we can draw out of our research project can be drawn from the different themes that are arising out of the key informant interviews. Second is, of course, where do we do these interviews? Can these interviews be carried out wherever we feel like, or wherever the respondents feel like, or are there specific locations that we must keep in mind when we are carrying out the interviews? When to do interviews, asking questions, how do we ask the questions, recording the interview, and representativeness and accuracy of the interviews that we are carrying out. So these are a few things that needs to be kept in mind with regard to the strategies of interviews that we are carrying out. Now let us look at each one of them. So with regard to recruiting interviews, often what should be kept in mind is what is the population that we are studying, and what is the sample that we have drawn out of that population to carry on our investigation further. Now, the kind of sample the research question requires will decide who to interview. Considering the population from which to select interviewees will be very helpful in finding out about people's attitudes and perceptions. Now, I will go back to the example that I have been taking in the duration in this course, that is on complementary feeding practice. Suppose we are interested in looking at the nutrition and health outcomes of children under 2. And we approach a certain community or a certain locality to carry out a survey, a sample survey, trying to collect quantitative data on nutrition outcomes. And some of the best nutrition outcomes data that has been stressed upon in the literature is with regard to, let us say, the BMI, the body mass index, or the stunting indicator, wasting indicator, severely stunting, severely wasting, underweight, overweight indicators, and so on. Now, suppose the survey has already captured information based upon which we have been able to generate the estimates on the nutrition outcome indicators. However, we need additional information for coming up with what are the real reasons and causes behind these nutrition outcomes that we are seeing as a part of this study. So then the question arises, who should we interview further after having completed the survey, so that we can come up with justifiable results or justifiable conclusions regarding a study that we have undertaken. Now, obviously, when our target group here is children under 2, the key informants should also be coming from the caregivers of children under 2. They may be fathers, or they may be mothers, or they may be older siblings or extended family members or members within the community who are taking care of the children when the primary caregivers are out of work, out of home because of work or for various other purposes. So then the recruitment of interviewees should take place from among the primary caregivers or the secondary caregivers who are present when the primary caregivers are not present in the location. Some of the other key informants could also include government functionaries who contribute to knowledge and awareness with regard to health and nutrition that reaches the households. In the Indian context, for example, you must have heard of integrated child development services or Anganwadi centers or various kinds of health centers that have representatives sent to the households so that they can provide information about nutrition outcomes. So, in this case, the Anganwadi workers or the ASHA workers or various ICDS representatives can also become key informants. And this is what we mean by recruitment of interviewees, because these are the key informants that can give us further information about what it is that is contributing to such nutrition deficiencies or positive nutrition outcomes, whatever may be the case. Second is, of course, target. We need to ensure to target a diverse range of people with different opinions or perceptions based on their own experiences and context. Now, given this example that I have just taken here, the target population is, of course, the caregivers of children under 2 and the government functionaries or community health workers who are contributing to the knowledge and awareness base of the caregivers of these children. However, we should also ensure regarding the representativeness of the information that we are getting. Now, given the target population that we have identified, it is possible that there is a wide distribution with regard to the sample that we have identified. For example, there may be households which are high on the income hierarchy, there may be households which are low on the income hierarchy. There may be households who have access to multiple sources of food, there may be households who are completely dependent only on government sources of food or only on the market for food. Therefore, we must purposively ensure that we are trying to include, whenever we are carrying out personal interviews, since it is in the hands of the interviewer to decide, keeping certain characteristics in mind regarding the samples that should be recruited for the interview, we should therefore ensure that the interviewees that are being recruited for this purpose also cater to various socioeconomic categories, so that the results that we are getting about the question in hand here, and the question in hand here is about complementary feeding practices, that can go a long way in coming up with a justifiable conclusion. The fourth strategy is with regard to advice of gatekeepers. Often there are we should recruit interviewees following the advice of the gatekeepers, such as NGO president, village man, or a community leader. Now, for example, here in the example that we have taken on complementary feeding practices and nutrition and health outcomes, the government functionaries that are looking after nutrition and health, let us say ICDS workers or Anganwadi workers, can also provide us information about who would be the best person to be interviewed in this case. Suppose there has been a government intervention and malnutrition among children have been checked in a certain community, and if there are households who have benefited out of these interventions, then the ICDS worker may be able to pinpoint that the interviewer that they must go to such and such household for getting information about the government interventions that has been able to check malnourishment in that particular household, and that is what we mean by gatekeeper advice. I have already referred to snowballing techniques and diversity of interviews, and also the fact that semi-structured interviews are the best technique are the best instrument to follow for when we are taking up snowballing techniques. And we should also try to get a great diversity of interviewees for our study. Snowballing technique, just to repeat, basically means that one interviewer gives us information about another interviewee that can be taken up for our study. Now, where should we carry out these interviews? Location is extremely important, because location affects the material gathered. It also influences the dynamics of the interview. It determines the way in which we present ourselves to potential interviewees, and it gives insights to our research. Often in the context of social science research, the location becomes very important. Suppose we are conducting a study on government interventions and government program benefits that are reaching the different households. It is not advisable to carry out such interviews in the open outside the household, because different government interventions have different benefits for different households. So, when we are carrying out such interviews in the public domain, within a village area, let us say, there may be certain households who have not been considered for a program, and there may be certain households who have been considered. So, in this case, it is possible that we are creating some kind of a divergence within the community, some kind of a division within the community when we are carrying out interviews in the open. And in such cases, it is advisable to find a secluded place, possibly within the house of the respondent that we have chosen for our study, where the interview should be carried out. Similarly, suppose we are carrying out a study, a personal interview on domestic violence, let us say, or child violence within the household, and here the home terrain becomes very difficult for us to carry out the interview. And in that case, the location, the timing of the interview becomes very important, because if we want to capture the information by one of the spouses regarding spousal violence, then we might actually direct the respondent to be available at their home within the home only when the other spouse is not present within the household. Therefore, location and timing of the interview is of utmost importance. What are the things that we should keep in mind when we are selecting the location? Of course, somewhere where the interviewee should feel comfortable. We must take into consideration distractions, because distractions will not help us record the interviews properly, ask the questions in a systematic manner. We must take into consideration how the location will be interpreted by the interviewee or others in the community. Often the gender of the interviewer also bears a lot of importance when we are carrying out interviews, because very secluded locations of interviews might become problematic for the interviewee to be able to give responses to the interviewer. Therefore, that must be kept in mind. We should not select locations that are potentially dangerous to the interviewer, and this is important when we are carrying out studies in conflict ridden situations or conflict ridden areas, when we are carrying out, when we are investigating questions that have importance to the life and property of the interviewees. And as I have already mentioned, we must also take into consideration the gender aspect very seriously. Now, why the timing is important? It is important because of the convenience of the interviewee affects the material gathered. Timing according to the time frame of the research is also important. Now, why the convenience of the interviewee is very important? Because an interview might take the duration of the interview might take somewhere between half an hour to 3 hours. So, if the interviewee is not comfortable regarding the timing and location of the interview that should be carried out, the results that we are getting, the material that we are gathering out of the interview gets affected, and therefore, it is important to keep this in mind. Now, how do we decide on the timing? Of course, the convenience of the interviewee bears a lot of importance when we are deciding on the timing, because we have to take into consideration distractions, social and gender aspects, potentially dangerous situations of the interviewee. We must take care of not putting the interviewee in potentially dangerous situations, and key individuals, as I have already mentioned, can be interviewed either in the beginning or at the end of the research, and the ideal way is to interview key individuals at both the beginning and the end of the field work. And often when the field work carries on for about for a longer duration, say for 1 month or 2 months or sometimes for 6 months or a year, when we are carrying out ethnographic studies, you would see that interviews taken at the beginning of the study and at the end of the study differ widely. And that also helps us come up with properly in concluding about the research question that we have taken up. Now, asking questions. So, certain things to be kept in mind about asking questions. Before starting the questions, we must make sure that the interviewee knows that what the research is all about. The interviewee should be assured of confidentiality, and the interviewee knows how long the interview is going to take and whether it should be recorded or not. With regard to asking questions, we must remember, the interviewer must remember that the interview is not an interrogation and it should be asked in an unthreatening manner as much as possible. We should not launch into complicated and sensitive questions at the start of the interview. I was taking the example of domestic violence or spousal violence as a topic that can be taken up for qualitative personal interviews, and since this is a sensitive topic to begin with, it is best to avoid opening the questions with very sensitive questions, because the ice breaking session between the interviewer and the interviewee needs to occur beforehand. Now, often it is important that even if we have a preset list of questions, we give the interviewee chance to develop their ideas and also ask clarification if necessary, and this is where the time frame of the interview becomes very important. We must engage with the process and listen to the responses carefully, and this engagement with the process can happen well if the interviewer is properly prepared for the interview. Therefore, understand that a personal interviews comes as a research method in the process of research that you have undertaken. So, therefore, the preparation of the interviewer is of utmost importance before initiating the interview. One should be completely aware of the literature that we have that helps us explain the responses of the interviewee properly. And at the end of the interview, we must provide the interviewee with an opportunity to ask questions to the interviewer, which is where, and sometimes the questions that the interviewee asks also lets us know what is on the mind of the interviewee with regard to the research question that we are investigating, and oftentimes it becomes very crucial for us in interpreting the responses that we are getting, and goes on to inform the conclusions that we are trying to draw out of our research study. Recording, certain things to be kept in mind are, it depends on the interviewee preference, logistics and language ability, as well as the nature of our research, and the possible forms of recording are many these days. But what are the benefits of direct recording? It allows us to concentrate completely on the interview without having to worry about taking notes or remembering points to write up later. Although this, it must be kept in mind that transcribing the research, transcribing the material from recorded devices also takes a lot of time and energy, and therefore these things must be judiciously decided upon, whether the interviewer is completely depending upon only recording devices or the interviewer is depending upon notes along with the recording devices. So, other benefits of direct recording are, it allows us to check the meaning of words and phrases that we may have missed during the interview, and this is of utmost importance when there is a language barrier, when there are language limitations of the interviewer and the interviewee. It is also very important if our research is examining forms of discourse. By having the actual words and forms of expression, we are better able to have, we will be able to have much greater source material for this form of analysis. Now, with regard to accuracy or representativeness issues, when using a small selection of interviewees to discuss wider trends in a group or community, researchers need to consider how representative the interviewees are of this wider group. I was taking the example of complementary feeding practices, and if the interviewees are the primary caregivers, and if we are researching a certain community or a diverse group of communities, the interviewer has to ensure that the primary caregivers belong to the different communities that we are studying, or if we are studying a certain community, it belongs to different age groups, belongs to different income categories, belongs to different socio-economic categories, and so on, so that we get a diversity of information with regard to the question that we are investigating. Now, if there are obvious biases, then these should be identified in the writing up of the research. There are of course issues of accuracy, issues of whether interviewees are telling the truth or whether they are telling the interviewer what they think is the right answer. Hence, the researcher's positionality and the way it will be interpreted by interviewees must always be considered. Now, the researcher's positionality is something that I would like to spend a little time on, where and this is something which is very important in the development question, and oftentimes in the literature it is also captured as insider outsider point of view. Suppose I belong to a certain community and I approach the same community, my community, for investigating a development question. Often my positionality as a researcher becomes very important. I may be very biased with regard to that community by virtue of the fact that I belong to that community, and I may want to listen to certain answers, and therefore the interviewee might just align with my biases and give me responses that I am interested in listening to, and that is something that is counterfactual to the research that I am undertaking. Therefore, it is important that the researcher clarify his or her positionality with regard to the research beforehand, so that researcher's own biases can be taken care of when the final findings of the research study comes in. Now, there is an aspect of accuracy that relates to household interviews. Often interviewers should not assume that all household members know about the activities of all the other members, and it is important to realize that there is no one correct response. All answers are partial and reflect the context in which they are given. This is important, assuming that all household members know about the activities of the other members. Often when we are carrying, and this is a limitation of household survey schedules as well, when we are carrying out a survey, often the respondent is either the male head of the household, oftentimes it is a male head of the household, and in in a minority of cases it is a female head of the household. And we always try to capture information regarding the household either from the male head of the household or the female head of the household. Suppose we have questions that are relating child care, or we have questions relating monetary transactions within that are being carried out between households in a certain locality. We give a lot of weight on what the male head of the household knows, but various studies have shown us that there are various kinds of transactions that take place by the household without the information of the male head or the female head of the household. Therefore, this assumption on the part of the interviewer that the respondent represents the house completely can lead into problem areas, and this is something that needs to be kept in mind when we are coming up with, when we are writing up the conclusion of the research, and also a limitation that can be adequately taken care of if the interviewer properly plans and designs the personal interviews with the other members of the households. So, what is the interview process? What are the different steps that that are contained in the interview process? One is, of course, we are developing the interview schedule, and this schedule is determined by the structure of the interview, the nature of the research and objectives of the study. We must ensure that there are short unambiguous questions which directly concern the main focus of the study, and we must include probing questions, but there is a risk of the question answer session becoming completely interrogative, and the interviewer must understand, the researcher interviewer, it is better to use the term researcher interviewer, because the interviewer here is conducting a research, which is why the personal interviews are being carried out. Therefore, the interviewer also runs the risk of making probing questions highly interrogatory in nature. However, that is something where the researcher needs to bear a lot of caution. Conducting the interview, in this there is the things to be kept in mind is it's a one-to-one interview. Relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee is very important, and active listening is an important aspect of the role of interviewer. There should be proper scope and space given to the interviewee to respond to the questions that are posed by the interviewer, and the primary role of the interviewer here is to be an active listener than to be constantly interfering in what the interviewee is trying to say. Verbal and non-verbal messages shape the social interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. Often the body language of the interviewee also goes on to explain a lot about what the interviewee is trying to convey to the interviewer, and keeping in mind the body language of the interviewee, the interviewer might also like to interfere and ask questions that can relax the interviewee further, so that the answers come uninterruptedly. Analysis of the interview data, we follow the same, we follow similar packets of analysis, where data reduction, data display and verification, software packages can be used for data analysis, and also one must understand that because this is primarily qualitative data that we are gathering as part of personal interviews, this is not linear and is influenced by the aims of the research and the methodological underpinnings of the study. Issues of rigor are very important in the interview process. Rigor basically refers to the concepts of credibility, transferability and dependability. These are issues that we have covered in the initial lectures on rigor in development research methods, and the students are encouraged to combine this lecture with the previous lecture on rigor to be able to understand these concepts in a better way. So, the accuracy of data collected varies according to how structured the interview is. It is necessary for the interviewer to be aware of the bias issues, which I have already pointed out when we are talking about insider, outsider, researcher points of view. Ethical considerations, protection of participants' rights, issues of informed consent and anonymity and confidentiality. These are also issues. Ethics related to development research methods has also been there has been a dedicated lecture on this in the previous in the early lectures. Therefore, you are again encouraged to look at those lectures while you are referring to this lesson. It is also necessary to ensure interviewees understand the study and to obtain written consent. Now, what are the challenging situations with regard to interviews? This is something that must be borne in mind. It may require a rethinking of strategies to collect data. While you are carrying out the interview, the interviewer might realize that the sufficient amount of information or accurate information is not coming from the interviewee, and it is then that a rethinking of the strategy might be required. Now, there are it must be comfortable surroundings are vitally important. Challenges in dealing with seriously ill participants, emotional issues and ethical issues also need to be carefully considered. So, these are some of the things that needs to be kept in mind when we are talking about personal interviews. However, focus group discussions or group interviews are a different exercise altogether, because when we are talking about when we are dealing with group interviews, there is a lot of information withdrawal that takes place as far as the different individuals that form a part of that group is concerned, and therefore a different technique needs to be employed when we are dealing with group discussions. And focus group discussions has come up in the recent years as one of the most widely used and also something that provides a lot of in-depth information regarding the research question that we are investigating. Now let us look at what are the basic characteristics of focus group discussions, how does one carry out a focus group discussions, and who are the main actors in a focus group discussion. Now what are focus groups? If you look at the slide here, it gives you some very basic idea about what are focus groups. Group based interviews, focus groups are basically group based interviews typically lasting from 1.5 to 3 hours and are conducted with around 6 to 8 participants. Therefore, focus group discussions also fall within the broad category of what is called participatory research approaches, which I will be taking up in the next class. Focus group represents a prime research tool of approaches of qualitative research, and it is widely used in the social sciences since the 1960s, and it is a well established, there is a well established history of application in the field of development. And one of the main processes for engendering public participation and facilitating the use of non-verbal techniques. Oftentimes we have seen that focus group discussions are mostly carried out with women participants, and one of the main reasons for carrying out FGDs, as they are widely known, is because the non-verbal interactions that take place within the group members and between the participants and the researcher himself or herself also becomes very integral, and it can be documented with proper interpretation. So, as a methodology, what does it do? It offers an excellent tool for exploring group behaviors, interactions and norms. It is a part of a mixed economy of social research, one component in multi-method strategies where multiple methods are themselves an emblem of methodological rigor, and it is commonly used to ascertain information on collective views of social issues. For example, issues related to HIV risks or issues related to issues of sexuality, even development, social development concerns such as sanitation, water, health, nutrition, time use and so on. It is also important for in-depth interview as well as for understanding the ways of doing. Now, a certain, like for example, complementary feeding practices. Now, a certain set of knowledge or a certain set of awareness might exist among the primary caregivers regarding how children should be fed once they have crossed the age of 6 months of age. However, the social practices and the taboos surrounding complementary feeding practices and the ways different primary caregivers go about doing complementary feeding are entirely different issues, and that is what focus group discussions can very well capture. It plays therefore an important role in participatory development process, and it provides an opportunity for retrospective introspection where the participants are brought together in a group. They are provided an environment to think about the questions that are posed to them, and this is what is referred to as retrospective introspection. They go back to the same questions over and over and over again, listen to the responses of their fellow participants, and then they are given ample time and opportunity to respond and revise their responses if the need arises. Now, what are the strengths and limitations of using focus groups in field research? Strengths, it is an excellent data on group views, beliefs and reasons for collective action. Limitations, groups can evoke misguided notions of a collective or community consensus, and this is where selection of the group is very important. Now, suppose we are suppose in a diverse community, in a community that contains diverse groups of population, if focus group discussions are carried out only with people belonging to a certain community while excluding all the others, we might have a certain set of findings. Whereas, if we have a diverse community represented in a focus group, we might have a different set of findings altogether, and these are things that need to be kept in mind by the researcher when deciding upon recruiting of members or participants as part of the focus group as well. Strengths, they are participatory and empowering as participants find strength in numbers and feel in control of the processes. Often surveys relating to self-help groups and participatory approaches with regard to community health and social behavior, finds very good results when we carry out focus group discussions. However, groups can also be subject to peer pressure and dominated by powerful voices, controversial views can be silenced, and this is where the role of the moderator, the facilitator, the observer becomes very important. I will come to those things in a minute. Now, it is also good for discussing sensitive topics among people whose lives are influenced by the same issue, but it is not good for understanding individual motivations, and therefore, dominant voices within the group have to be moderated by the moderator, by the facilitator with some experience. It can lead to collective action as a result of people sharing their experiences, but recruitment of participants as FGD can be difficult, time consuming and often unsuccessful. It is also a very good platform for using PRA techniques such as rankings, mapping and other visual methodologies. Moderation facilitation is a skill technique and it requires practice, and therefore often inexperienced moderators are not able to gather proper information through FGDs. FGDs can generate rich and abundant data. However, the data can be difficult to analyze if the researcher or the interpreter is not able to come up with proper themes based upon the data that have been collected. However, it needs to be kept in mind that FGDs are accessible to people who have difficulties with literacy, such as children. Suppose when we are carrying out survey schedules, we are canvassing survey schedules, you would find that literacy becomes, or being educated or having access to some amount of education becomes a limitation or a gap in being able to collect the desired information through the survey schedules, and that is where FGDs and one-to-one conversation in a group helps the participants to open up about their issues and have a more meaningful discussion. Now, what are the phases in which one can incorporate focus groups into a development project? One is gaining background information on a research topic. When they are frequently used in pre-pilot studies to explore issues, used to explore differences in the use of language and vernacular terms, and used for in-depth interviews. Encouraging of a reflexive capability when we are exploring issues in depth, excellent tool for gauging public attitudes to events, campaigns, policies, etc. And engender co-public participation as part of PRA. It is used to facilitate public and community participation and is also an effective tool in community research agendas. Now, this is something that I would like to focus on, encouraging a reflexive capability with respect to the participants that we are studying. I have in the past taken example of mixed methods approaches where the focus is on transformation, the focus is on coming up with some kind of a transformative idea, so that the participants themselves are empowered to carry out some change within the community that we are studying. And this is also where FGDs play a very important role, where we are bringing in participants and initiating a discussion that can move towards the change that we may have thought about. The logistics and realities of using a focus group: first is we have to plan a focus group in the field. So, selection, recruitment and organization of the groups, and this process can be lengthy and a complicated experience. In our example of complementary feeding practices, the difficulties that we have faced with regard to gathering participants of FGD is the time requirement. Often the women that we want to be participants in our study have been found to be otherwise engaged during the time that we are available in the field for carrying out FGDs. Prior information to the primary caregivers regarding their presence in the FGD discussions also does not materialize because of various household engagements that they are busy with, and also the fear of going out into the public domain and giving out information that may be detrimental to their own household also does not allow them to come out into the open, and therefore it requires a lot of conversation and lot of engagement with the participants to be able to bring them to the FGD. Group composition: we must carefully consider the social composition of the group. Issues of power and social status must be considered. Now, suppose we have in a certain community, we have a very dominant person as a participant in the FGD. Let us say someone who has very high social, very large social networks, and who is very moneyed and who has a lot of knowledge base with regard to government schemes and so on as a part of the group, then the other members of the group might not want to open up to the discussions that are underway in that group, and therefore the members of the group must be very carefully chosen. So, there are methodological considerations also that should be of paramount importance to the success of FGDs. Now, with regard to recruitments and incentives, FGDs can consist of strangers or of pre-existing social groups, but we must ensure research ethics and guidelines, and and consideration must also be given to where and when the groups will be held, the focus group discussions will be held. Things to keep in mind for conducting focus groups: a discussion guide can be structured or informal. Moderator should start by briefly outlining the purpose and ethical considerations, and focus groups are often recorded, they are taped. The recording permissions should be taken from the participants beforehand, and often we begin with how questions and then move on to why questions, and then we summarize the discussion. Now, analyzing focus group data also follows the standard analyzing procedures, where we should draw on established qualitative methods, and we need to transcribe the taped data from the group, and speech should be transcribed as it was spoken, and we may identify themes and locate materials in the transcripts. Let me summarize the key steps involved in focus group discussions. Step 1 is we select a field team. Now, in this field team, first we come up with a moderator. The moderator is someone who is very central to the conducting of FGDs. Who is a moderator? The moderator is also known as a facilitator, and she should have knowledge and experience or skills in leading FGDs, and at the least understand the importance of assisting all members to speak at some point. So, if a FGD contains 8 to 10 members, it is the moderator's responsibility to ensure that each and every member of the group has spoken, and it is the moderator's responsibility to prod all the members to speak about the questions that are being asked. The moderator should be able to manage dominant group members, have an ability to ask open questions and follow up with relevant additional questions to stimulate conversation and reflection. It is not desirable to run them as a question response exercise. In that situation, people are more likely to respond to what they think the interviewer wants to hear. So, if the interviewer goes with the question regarding the best practices on complementary feeding, and the participants in the group are not completely aware of what is the objective of this research, then it is possible that everybody, all the participants of the group respond to questions in such a manner that they are answering questions pertaining to the best practices that should be carried out, and therefore, the real picture does not come out. And this can happen if the moderator is inexperienced enough to counter question and come up with factual information about complementary feeding, say for example. Interpreter. We must make sure that the FGDs are conducted in the local language or in the language the participants feel most comfortable in, and if needed we may use interpreters that have been trained or train them in their role as translators in FGDs. They need to translate directly as far as possible and not get involved themselves in the discussion and then translate back an edited version, and that is the importance of interpreter. When we have a language problem, the interpreter must be trained enough to ensure that the interpretation that is happening, of the translation that is happening of the local language, must be in the direct speech and in totality, rather than an edited version or a summarized view of what the participant is trying to say. Observer. The role of observer is very important. Now, it can be effective to have two people, usually we have two people conducting focus group. There is a moderator or facilitator and an observer. A moderator or facilitator is someone who veers around the group, who asks question, goes into counter questioning, and who ensures that the conversation is on, whereas the observer is someone who takes down notes and only observes the body language of the participants involved. So, it can be effective to have two people conducting the focus group, one asking the questions of the moderator and one writing and observing expressions, body language, etc., which can give clues about sensitivities, etc. So, when using an interpreter, however, the moderator might be able to do both given the lag time for translation. Now, there needs to be a clear motive if any other staff is to be present during an FGD. So, for example, in our complementary feeding case, when we carried out focus group discussions, we ensured that one of the Anganwadi workers is also present with clear instruction given to the functionary here about not interfering in the questions that are being posed to the participants themselves. The Anganwadi worker is present here in this FGD. In our case, we may ensure that the Anganwadi worker is present, because she in turn can be a key informant with regard to our personal interviews that we plan to carry out later in the later part of the research process, where we can take references to the information coming from the focus group discussion participants and then throw back those questions to the Anganwadi worker who is a key informant, that can come up, and so that we can come up with matching results. We must also make sure that none of the field staff are biased to the subject at stake. There is no personal or organizational interest or have a role that might obstruct participants to speak out freely. Step 2 is to determine what type and number of groups needed. In each location, there should be interviews with elderly women, elderly men, adult women, adult men. If it does not inhibit conversations, age groups or gender could be mixed when it would be inconvenient to them to be separated, as long as the topic does not relate to or is affected by gender or age stereotypes, and as long as there is some possibility of also gaining disaggregated information. As far as possible, we must also interview adolescent girls and boys if the moderator is trained or experienced in interviewing young people under 18, but we must be careful to follow certain best practices and rules and regulations that are in place with regard to child protection. We must ensure wherever possible to target specific groups with disabilities and attempt to meet with indigenous or other minority groups. The group size, as I have mentioned, the ideal size is about 8 to 10. Sometimes the ideal size mentioned for focus group discussions are also 6 to 8, depending upon the research that we are in a question that we have designed, and also the conduciveness of gathering participants for a study. The ideal size can range between 6 to 12, but smaller and larger groups can work well, and oftentimes judgment must be made quickly on the spot as not to offend or inconvenience people. If the space available is noisy, we must try to make the group smaller to facilitate hearing. We must make every effort to ensure that non-participants are not present. Anybody who has nothing to do with the question that we are asking should not be present in the vicinity of the FGD, because that directly affects the responses of the participants. We must try to ensure that people such as community leaders or representatives are not mixed in the groups, as they may also discourage others from speaking freely. If such people are present, it is best to interview them separately. And the nature of this kind of work is that all the best laid plans are likely to disappear out of the window when the team arrives at the venue, and therefore quick thinking and flexibility is required to manage the best outcome in what is likely to be a chaotic circumstance. Step 3, we must prepare for the individual FGD. So, location is very important. We must try our best to organize meeting in a private, safe and comfortable environment. For example, not directly under the sun, and that it is accessible. In the current conditions, we must be prepared to compromise and check with the groups that the compromise works for them. Date and time, we must ensure mobilization of participants before the meeting as far as possible, and inform community leaders in advance of the discussion so that they are aware of it. If it is a local agency, if a local agency is, for example, facilitating our access to communities, we must ask them to explain the purpose of our visit as much possible, and prepare the groups to reduce time lost in confusion. We must also plan with our team beforehand how we divide groups between us. For example, who will be the moderator, who will be the observer, and whether we want to change roles in between if the interview is not going properly. You want to aim for as much consistency of approach that results are also comparable. The final step is on conducting of the FGD. How do we do? We first introduce the focus group by explaining the reason for the visit. It is important to explain the rationale to avoid raising expectations. We must explain what we will do with the information and be very clear that when asking about needs, there is no guarantee that things will change. However, to the extent possible, we must pass on their feedback to relevant authorities. Often, when we are carrying out focus group discussions on a certain government intervention, let us say, the participants might want us to reach the information to the local authorities about the problems that they are facing. Now, we must not unnecessarily promise or unrealistically promise the participants regarding the success of what we can or cannot do. However, we may try to help as much as possible. However, there should not be any promise regarding the fact that their situation might be better because of our interventions. The discussion might touch upon some sensitive issues such as security and violence. We must ensure that participants there are under no requirement to respond if the question causes discomfort, and this is something that must be kept in mind. We must reassure participants that confidentiality will be kept throughout, in that no names or personal information will be disclosed or used in any publications and reports. This is the ethical, this is the ethics part of the confidentiality part of the consent, the informed consent with regard to the final publication of the research reports. We must explain that we will be taking notes during the interview to help you remember what was said, but that these are for our own personal use and will not be shared with others. Often we when as facilitators or observers we are taking down notes of the group behavior, the group may become suspicious with regard to what is being noted down, and therefore the frequency of the responses might come down, or there may be a chaos among the group members with regard to the conversation going on, with regard to continuing of the conversation. Therefore, it is important that the facilitator and the observer make it very clear to the group beforehand that there will be constant note taking taking place during the period of the focus group discussion. We must make sure that our notes reflect as closely as possible what was said. When it comes to analyzing outcomes, the more detailed capture the better, and the more likely you are to have quotable passages which can be very powerful, and therefore not taking notes is not a very good exercise. We must ask if there are any questions before starting the interview, and make sure to take some notes about the demographics of the group. And lastly, we must be mindful that these are people who have suffered great loss and trauma, and are also all individuals who have their own stories. So, for example, in this the example of suppose there has been a typhoon in an area, and we might like to ask people what they did before the typhoon, and in our experience people also do not mind telling a bit of their experience of the typhoon. So, we must use our own judgment and be a bit creative about ensuring that people tell their stories which might go on to inform the research question that we are studying. So, with this let me end with this lesson on interviews and focus group discussions. There are two important things we tried to touch upon. One is personal interviews and the other is group interviews. Now, personal interviews have their own dynamics because it is a one-on-one interview where we are trying to come up with a perception or an understanding of the perceptions of the individuals concerned, whereas group interviews have a different kind of dynamics where it might lead to collective action regarding the research question that we are studying, and the themes that are emerging as part of focus group discussions are also may be very different from the personal interviews that we are carrying out. These are the final step is on the tips for facilitator, observer and interpreter. The final tips are as follows, where we must notice body language and expressions as relevant. We must make sure to listen to participants, non-judgmentality, and intervene if others are judging them, reminding them of the respect for others' opinions. We must encourage that only one person talks at a time and remind people and the interpreter not to go too long in between translation, as we will lose a lot of detail. It can be helpful sometimes, especially in one-on-one interviews, to put a question in the form of a role play. For example, you might say something like, imagine I am the head of the agency or a local authority, what would you say to me? And we must also use neutral comments and encourage the quieter people to contribute by constantly asking them if there is anything else, does anyone else have something to add, how about this side of the group, and so on. We must also explain to interpreters the importance of translating sentence by sentence and not summarizing what people say. So, interviewers should help interpreters by asking only one short question at a time and by reminding them about confidentiality of the discussions. So, these are the references that have been used for this lesson, and as always I encourage the students to for a comprehensive literature on the topics that we have covered, you may also go through the references of these citations that have been used for this lesson. So, I will see you in the next class. Thank you.